Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Techstrong Research. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of it or you would just like to share it with a friend, it will be made available after today's session concludes. On the right side of the screen, you'll find a couple tabs. The Q&A tab is where we'd like you to send any questions in you have for today's panel. And the chat tab right next to it is where we want you to engage with one another and engage with us. I know Mitch likes to strike up all kinds of conversations in the chat tab, so feel free to chat with him throughout today's presentation. Finally, at the end of our webinar today, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So stick around to see if you're one of our 4 lucky winners. But onto the panel today. The topic is connecting observability to business results, and it's part 1 of a 2-part series. I'm joined today by 3 of my esteemed colleagues: Dan Kirsch, Managing Director and Co-founder at Techstrong Research; Judith Hurwitz, President of Techstrong Research; and Mitch Ashley, CTO of Techstrong Group and Principal at Techstrong Research. It is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to our guests today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Cody. We're going to do a little kind of round robin here between the 3 of us. It's exciting to talk about observability because the proliferation of microservices and cloud and all kinds of new technologies have really kind of risen this new need that's coined the term. Now we know it's not a new market in some ways. It's a very entrenched market with some players as well as newcomers to the market as well. So I'm going to start off our conversation just with a working definition. I mean, working as in, we're not going to go put this up on Wikipedia as the official definition. Every vendor, every analyst firm tends to have their own definition of observability. And there are a couple things that I like to call out about it. One is that usually a working definition has something about the ability to understand what's happening inside a system as well as the interaction across systems, knowing what's happening, being able to connect the dots, if you will, end to end across infrastructure, applications, data, network, multiple locations, hybrid cloud, et cetera, so that you can then be able to understand what's happening, diagnose issues, also do things like assess performance, as well as how well the application is meeting ultimately the business definition. Now, those definitions tend to evolve from more of a pure play greenfield startup company might talk more about the microservices, cloud native aspect of it. And if you're going with a more entrenched or traditional vendor's definition, it might tend to be more of an extension of monitoring, the typical logs and metrics that we have through monitoring. So I'm curious with my colleagues, and it's great to be doing this with Dan and Judith. From your perspective, what might we change or add to that kind of a working definition?
So my point of view is that we've really moved into an era of distributed computing. So if we think about sort of this new world, it isn't just one. If we could have a perfect world, we would have one system that would have all of our assets and all of the ways we communicate with applications and systems, but we don't. That world is gone. So the world we are in is where we have just a massive number of services and capabilities and hardware and data and security requirements and applications, whether they are sitting on a mainframe computer and have been around for 20 years, or if they are SaaS applications or cloud native services. So it's really, we're in a world that is highly distributed, but we need it to act and behave as though it's one unified system.
Yeah, and following up on that, I think a big part of it is also hybrid and multi-cloud. So, all these cloud, AWS, Azure, Google, they all have their own monitoring systems, but almost every company is a multi-cloud, whether it was strategic or just different business units adopting different clouds or through acquisition. But monitoring these different services that have their own built-in management system becomes really tough, because to understand what's going on in your AWS environment, you need to understand those tools, but then those are going to be very different and a different skill set for a different cloud. And then, of course, you have your on-prem infrastructure as well, adding to the complexity.
I would add to the conversation a couple things. One is everything is software now. So we no longer kind of separate the physical world unless we're talking about it in our own data center. And even then, SD-WAN and much of it's being virtualized. But we're living in a technology stack that's much deeper and broader. It's all software. It's kind of how we have to think about it. And at the same time, we're using more porous types of software architectures. What I mean by that are things like containers and microservices that it used to be hard to get in to see the insides of an application because they're monolithic. They're built with internal procedure calls or other mechanisms for functions to talk together. Now they talk through microservices, and those microservices might serve multiple apps, not just one app, for example. And to really understand what's happening, to triage, to respond to an event or issue, you do have to be able to peer inside the application, and that's much easier to do. But the other side of it is we have hundreds, thousands of those microservices across an app or multiple apps. That's a lot of complexity, a lot more information. What are all those doing, and how do I look, and what do I look at to determine what's useful?
And the other issue with microservices is there are actually a lot of business risks, because if you have a microservice and it is going to be used in, let's say, 20 different virtual applications where I'm putting together 15, 20 microservices into containers, and I operate that way. Now, let's say that there is an issue with a microservice, either a security issue, it's not architected well, there's some problem with it. Now you replicate that service across customers, partners, employees, across your software supply chain. You are not just creating one problem, but you are creating havoc across your entire software supply chain.
Well, I think that also, I think both of you guys have talked about sort of the focus on the applications. So, with the cloud, you aren't really thinking about infrastructure as much. So it used to be, if you wanted to build, a robust, predictable application, you built robust infrastructure, and you really focused on the infrastructure, and then application robustness was sort of secondary. But I think with this, the recent AWS outages and people thinking about how can we sort of build robust applications, people are more thinking about needing to peer into their apps and into the how they design applications for failover, disaster recovery, and just general robustness. And Judith, you brought up supply chain, which is also a huge part of it. You got APIs and different microservices. Sometimes you don't even know exactly what's making up your applications, and if there's a security flaw or a performance flaw, it's all important.
Absolutely, because that container in that you're putting all those microservices into is in many ways a black box. Your typical developer can't say, "Gee, let me open up that container and see what's inside."
Or there's not an easy directory to go, oh, container 6AB, that does X, right? We have to understand all those pieces. When we talk about observability, a question we asked early on, maybe still asked today, what's the difference between observability and monitoring? And a lot of the folks companies that are in this space, of course, come from the monitoring, logging, kind of traditional ITOps type of applications. One of the new things that's been introduced along the way with microservices is tracing, that being the ability to kind of connect the dots, as you referred to it, Judith, across microservices. Another thing that is much more common for us to talk about is telemetry data, meaning we're getting data from all parts of that stack, all locations across the software stack, and being able to handle or manage that telemetry data is more than just logging events, more than just logging something happened. There's a lot of fidelity of information available to that, but there's a lot of, through that richness, a lot of complexity to be able to understand.
And Mitch, we were having a discussion earlier about some of the standards in telemetry that are emerging. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and it's a great opportunity to breach or talk about the open source part of this industry, element of our industry, which I think is a bit unique. Open source has been with us for a long time, and the business model of open source has evolved a lot since I kind of got involved in it in the early 2000s. And today, I think one of the most interesting aspects about the observability market is the role that open telemetry and other open source projects have played and are playing, and how the vendor community are really embracing that as a common standard, de facto standard, if you want to think of it that way. Because, I mean, the kind of companies that are on the board of the open telemetry software project, I should say, range the gamut from big traditional players like Microsoft and Facebook and folks like that have been on the board at different times, to Honeycomb and Splunk and Lightstep, who's now part of another company. There's a great many different companies who now see that open source strategy as a way to now add a different area that they differentiate in. In other words, it's not who has the best agent. Everybody has an agent. Who has the best data collector? Everybody has a data collector. And that's really what the open telemetry does, at least in part, is give a framework for interpreting that data and then providing it to another layer that can do rich analytics with it and analysis and all of the above.
So
yeah, I think you make a good point, Mitch. So I mean, that's sort of where the battle is right now, or it's sort of emerging between the different market players is what are you going to do with the data? Because the logs on their own aren't particularly interesting. There's no human in the world that can make sense of them at the speed. It makes sense of them. You can spend all day looking at them, and it's going to be meaningless, and you're going to be 3 days behind pretty quickly. So it's all about the analytics. Reducing false positives is huge, because there's vendors who say, yeah, we'll catch 99% of stuff, but if one alert out of 400 is useful, then it's a useless product. So you need to. That's a big thing, is reducing false positives, so that, I mean, we've heard of lots of end users turning off alerts because they're not useful, and then you miss emerging problems.
Judith, you've talked before in conversations we've had, I think maybe even publicly, talked about the difference between causality and correlation. A lot of what we've been doing in the modern monitoring world, hopefully it's been helpful, it has been in the correlation. But what's the difference do you see between those two?
Yeah. So correlation says, I see that there's a pattern between X factor and Y factor. Well, there may in fact, be a correlation, but it doesn't mean anything. So the famous example of men who buy diapers also buy beer. Therefore, there's a correlation between. So I should do a display in my store that has diapers and beer in the same shelf. Well, it's just, it's happenstance, but there's not a correlation. Causality is actually much more meaningful, because what you're looking for is what is the cause and effect of an event that happens. So if we can look at issues from what is the cause of a problem we're having, as opposed to looking at it from correlation, which may or may not be meaningful. And I think this goes hand in hand with observability, because we don't want to know, is there some weird correlation that might just be, it just happens to correlate, but it doesn't mean anything. We're looking for, what is the cause of something? What are the ways that we can actually understand? So this problem was caused between, I have a defective microservice that has a security hole in it, that somebody put in some little element into my microservice that puts a security hole and gives me a way to burrow into my system. Now, the cause of that outage is not necessarily that, gee, maybe my systems aren't the right level of performance. The cause is actually, there's a security breach, there's a security problem within a specific microservice. So the cause is an outage, and the reason for that outage is a security breach.
It sounds like context is a big part of this too, right? And you're adding meaning to the event or to the telemetry, that information, that you're trying to connect those things together, but with intelligence, not just with connection.
With I think and the word is with context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think some of that's a good point, Mitch and Judith, is trying to sort of put the experience and the context that really experienced staff might have, and putting that into the software as well. I mean, there isn't, no company can hire enough people or has a budget to fully staff their IT organization in every way that they possibly want. So if you're able to have some of these observability tools are able to build in the type of experience that someone with 10, 20 years of experience might have. So then a more junior person can spot an emerging problem and understand the context without having to have seen the same problem 3 times and know, okay, we're getting this error, so it must be this problem, and sort of building that into the products.
I think it'd be interesting to turn to, and not to give away the title of the webinar, give the answer first, but I think it's really helpful to, we as analysts, it's one of the things about Techstrong Research, we're focused on the business outcome. Why does it matter? Why are we spending all this technology or money on technology, or why is this in particular better than something else? Judith, do you want to talk about, the why of observability and maybe how that relates to business and business process and some things like that?
Yeah. So I think if we think about, why does a business care about observability, it's because, increasingly software itself is really defining the business. It's no longer that software is that backroom function, but in fact, the way you interact with customers, especially in the era, we've moved into an area, I think, accelerated by COVID, where customers increasingly are interacting with their partners and with their suppliers via application software. And I think this also goes into the area of business process, because where people are having trouble hiring people in this era, more and more companies are relying on business process based software to interact with their customers. And I think that this is one of the key areas that needs to be addressed by observability. How can I create a business process that I actually know is having the type of results that I expect, and the type of relationships I expect to have with my customers, suppliers, and partners? if we can observe that and see and see what is actually happening, because maybe I've set up some sort of bot or some sort of business process environment where I think that I'm responding in a virtual way to all of my customers' concerns, but I actually end up providing them with this endless loop where I keep answering the same thing. No matter what they ask me, I have the same answer over and over again. And what's the customer interaction is these guys don't know what they're doing. Their processes are all, crazy, and I'm not going to do business with them. So it's the ability to provide observability of your overall environment. And well, I think Boris mentioned the idea of this, of having a baseline. Well, how do you define a baseline when you have constant change? And I think that's one of the areas that observability from a software perspective can really help us, because that baseline is going to change. It may be once a month. It may be twice a day.
I was going to add to that because baselines, there's a conversation kind of running, started by Boris, around measuring, baselining. You can't manage what you can't measure. To tie it back to the business outcome, one that I think is fairly straightforward for most of us to pin it on is there's a great deal of emphasis in the business at a strategic level of what the customer experience is. And a simple example of that is response time. Whether it's a page load, whether it's a flow of transactions, whether it's a measure of some part of delivering that service over mobile, over a network, over a web page, whatever. And that telemetry data is extremely useful, but if it's trapped in a monitoring system, if it's trapped in a way where it's there, we just can't get to it in a useful way to then inform an SRE to do performance improvements on an app, for an architect to look at, okay, in these scenarios, we need to rethink our dynamic cloud infrastructure and how we might scale more rapidly or tune that down to not have to consume too many resources.
And I think what Dan brought up earlier was this idea that each of the systems that you may be monitoring, has its own unified world. So from an observability standpoint, if I'm measuring system A, system B, and system C, and everything is fine, but these systems don't live in isolation. So it's really important to think about this outside of that single unified log system or monitoring system that doesn't understand the context across all of these services that are increasingly unified.
Yeah, then just following up on what Mitch was saying, what's critical is it's not even just the customer-facing applications. And I'm thinking about, food delivery services and Uber, and got a flat tire the other day, and the tow truck, I could look on my mobile phone to see where the tow truck was. All of those users expect applications to work just like Gmail works, and they don't necessarily understand the complexities of making a really great application, everything from user experience to the functionality to the speed. And so everyone expects sort of consumer grade and consumer satisfaction with business applications now. So no one even, same thing with office workers. No one wants to say, oh, this is a corporate app, so I understand it's dirty and ugly and slow. Everyone wants great applications. So I think the observability is also getting pushed for every single application within the organization, whether it's your critical customer engagement app or if it's internal apps.
Let's talk a little bit about the use cases, because I think there's some interesting things that have happened and kind of been built upon, as well as where it's going next. We've talked about sort of the evolution from monitoring, the typical logs, metrics, and traces into observability and the interconnectivity that all means. Certainly one use case is cloud native that brings in the microservices element that we've talked about, the much more kind of layers, containerized services as well as layers. I think another one that's helped elevate the need and use of observability is this idea of what you were saying to Judith about software is everything, right? Software is what drives the business, whether it's the app or the infrastructure. And that software-driven environment means we're interested in a lot more than we were. And we can't just rely on SLAs from some other vendor to do this for us. We still have to deliver on our customer experience, on our SLO, speaking in an SRE term. Dan, what about security? That's also often is interlaced with observability, and there's some interesting things that have happened there.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is some of the companies that are getting into this observability space have also played in the security area, because in security there's tons of logs, and understanding the logs and putting connections and context between those is ultimately what you need to do to create a secure organization. So in terms of observability, it gives you insight to how your applications are running, what potential problems you might be having. So with this Log4j recent news or vulnerability, a lot of companies don't know what's running within their application. So if you can have a way of peering into the application and understanding, your landscape, that's a big advantage for the security organization, but it also gives DevOps teams or DevSecOps teams the ability to be part of that security conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just like we're moving from monitoring to observability, we're moving from the SOC, which is an event-driven concept, now to we have, just like all of its software, we have to think about security of all of that as well. Judith, in some conversations you've talked about software supply chain management and bill of materials, and to Dan's point about Log4j, that's one of those where that vulnerability could be at multiple places in all kinds of third-party internal services, any variety of places. Kind of points out the areas where we might have visibility into that supply chain and areas where we don't.
Yeah, so I think we tend to have visibility, traditionally into logs from systems. What we don't tend to have good visibility is, especially as we move into this new world of microservices, containers, software as a service. I mean, many organizations don't think of their SaaS applications as a separate unit, but really part of their computing infrastructure. But on the other hand, those SaaS vendors control their environment on their own, and they don't think of their SaaS application as part of your infrastructure. So you have very little control over what a vendor does to create, manage, and provide access to all the services within a SaaS application. So this can make observability even more complicated for businesses that are trying to not only have a handle on what's happening within their own microservices and with their own containers and applications, but also within that SaaS application. A number of years ago, I was talking to a CIO who was telling me that they were using a SaaS application, and the vendor's system went down. Similar to what might happen when Amazon had its major outage last month. So then the question becomes, when the head of a major department responsible for huge amounts of revenue for the company calls up the CIO and says, something is wrong with your organization because my application that I depend on to get money into my part of the business is not operating. You need to fix it. Now, I can say to them, well, you see, this Amazon Web Service went down and they can't tell us when it's going to be back up. Do you think that business leader who is looking at the fact that they are losing $1 million a minute is going to be very sympathetic? Well, they're not. So it's the idea of this software supply chain that's only getting more complicated. How do we have observability across this supply chain? I don't think that there is yet a concrete answer to say, well, you do it this way. And it may be through some open source projects like maybe Open Telemetry and some others that are evolving that are going to help. But I think that the industry itself has a lot of work to do.
Great. Anything to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, I think Judith brings up a good point with understanding your entire IT environment, including those SaaS applications. And what I'm thinking about is some of the partners who are also so dependent on these SaaS ecosystems. So ServiceNow, Salesforce, Google Apps, they all have ecosystems with some, lots of startups, but also some pretty significant partners who have built entire businesses based on that ecosystem. So it's critical for those companies to understand the underlying platform and platform as a service in the cloud that they're building on. So they need to, and they sometimes need to tweak their offerings because as cloud offerings do, they're constantly being updated, they're being changed, and your app that you built based on that platform could be drastically impacted by a small change that the cloud vendor does. And Salesforce isn't calling all of their partners and saying, hey, we're coming out with this little update today, and we'll come out with 3 tomorrow and 4 the next day. So that comes into the observability equation as well.
And I think this goes along with sort of the notion of the industrialization of the cloud. We are at the point where with the cloud where we've moved, probably 7 or 8 years ago, people thought about the cloud to do extra compute or some extra storage, or when I'm when I'm piloting a new application, then I'll go to the cloud, or I've got some, external applications that are not core to the business, and I'll use the cloud. Smaller companies always, assumed that cloud was their infrastructure. What has changed is that larger Fortune 1000 companies are now looking at the cloud not just as auxiliary, but as their computing environment. And this actually raises the stakes for observability. Because if that is my computing infrastructure, and I am depending on that, not just for occasional use, but to run my business, it really does raise the stakes.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, go ahead, Mitch.
I was just going to say, our old school internal change control boards don't approve those changes from Salesforce, right, Dan?
Right.
That is true.
And I think following up, Judith was talking about the maturation of the cloud, and the cloud, as it's matured, it's gotten really, really complicated, driven by, business need. But I mean, you have lots of databases as a service. You have various types of GPUs. You can run on bare metal. You can run on a hypervisor of your choice. There's even quantum computing on demand. So the cloud is getting so complex that observability is becoming important because you just have this complicated cloud environment, and you need to understand how the different elements are performing.
See, I'm going to interject too, just kind of a programming note. This is part 1 of a conversation on observability. We're Techstrong Research are doing these webinars on a monthly basis, so I expect that our next version of the webinar in February, we'll do part 2. So kind of back to the topic, one of the things I'd like to introduce to you, I think you both have maybe heard me speak about this. I think one of the fundamental factors that has changed the game and really forced us into a world where we need to think about an observability strategy is, I grew up in the world of software had a state. We put together a release, we pushed it into production, and it lived there. And it made, in those days, it lived for several months, sometimes pretty long. Now we live in the world where everything changes all the time. Some people call it dynamic. I think of it as we've moved from our environment was a solid where we could pick it, say it's at this state at a particular point in time, to now it's a fluid. It's like dipping our toe in a river. At any point in time, it's always different because we're pushing out small releases, in a DevOps type tool process or delivery process, changes from our third-party suppliers, SaaS vendors, things that we don't control, the environment. We don't know what's happening at that data center in Kansas City, but that's their part of it, and who knows what's changed. So we have to rethink about it. Isn't that we're monitoring, it's this flow of software across all of that software stack that we need to understand.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point. We haven't talked about it, but there's also, financial, observability. A part of it is financially driven because, let's say you've got API calls built into applications, and that company changes their billing. You want to be, and you're looking for an alternative. You want to be able to understand what parts of your application will be impacted by those API calls. And if you're thinking about using a different API from a different company, how can you do that without breaking your application? Does it make sense? Or are you totally locked in? And the same thing, it's going back into supply chain. So, and understanding your API. So obviously supply chain was sort of the theme of 2021. And here we are in 2022 talking about supply chain and software supply chain. But I think that's a big part of the observability conversation as well.
Well, let's do this with the time remaining that we have. I'd love to have us share our thoughts on the state of the market. What's the maturity of observability? Are we in the first inning, we're in the seventh inning stretch? Maybe the question to start with, we always ask when something new comes out, is observability a marketing term for what we already know, or is it really something new? Have we answered that question? Are we confident that it is a new thing or an evolution of a thing, not just repackaged monitoring?
So I would say that what we have is, and we'll get into this in part 2, but it is a market, but it's also based on the experience and work of vendors that have been very active in the monitoring, log management market, that are evolving very quickly to take advantage of their platforms, their base of customers to basically move to this next level of maturity. So we've got some vendors who are the incumbents in this market who are moving very quickly. Then we're already seeing the evolution of emerging vendors that are being funded by the venture world, that are up and comer. So it's going to become a very hot, very dynamic market, and it's already starting.
Yeah, I think there's a path we've seen in the security world. There was SIM, security, incident and event management, and so SIM for many years. You collected logs, and then if there was an incident, you could do forensics on it. If auditors came, you could say, look, we're complying, we have all these logs, but no one really ever did anything with those logs. Then a number of years ago, maybe 7-8 years ago, some companies came out with SIM 2.0. And with 2.0, you were doing analytics on those logs and doing some correlation and starting to really understand what those logs meant. And you had the legacy companies were still involved in SIM. Some of the legacy companies they're still around. They're getting pulled out left and right. Some evolved. A lot were, and then there were net new companies, and sort of SIM 3.0 was using advanced analytics with these logs and some machine learning, and there were a lot of startups. A lot of them got acquired by the legacy companies because just build it or buy it, and buying it was sort of faster and to stay market relevant, and so I think we're sort of in inning one of. Rather than going monitoring 2.0, we've come up with this term observability. I think it's a good one. So we're seeing a bunch of companies who are hate to say legacy, but I'm going to legacy
market incumbents.
Incumbents is much nicer of a term. So companies like VMware, we have Splunk, Sumo Logic, Azure, AWS. They're all sort of using their IP and technology to apply it to this DevOps and operations data. Then we've got some net new companies. There was Honeycomb.io, Lightstep acquired by ServiceNow. We've got StackState who's in this area. And then I tried to put together a quick list of acquisitions, and it's been a busy space.
So that's going to be what our session 2 is going to be about. We're going to get into some detail about who the players in the markets are, what the acquisitions that we're seeing, and one thing I will let you know about is that the topic of observability is going to be blown out into a new offering that Techstrong Research has that we call market vistas. And these are market landscapes that look at a lot of the issues that we've been discussing here today. We'll go into more depth, who the players are. We're not going to try to make this a beauty contest and say who are the winners and who are the losers, but we're going to explain what each of these vendors offer, what they're doing, who are the upstarts in a specific market. So watch this space for the first market vista that will be focused on observability. And as I said, in part 2 of this webinar, we're going to dig into what some of the key vendors are doing in this market. So back to you, Mitch.
Good. Did you want to jump in?
I think. Go ahead, Mitch.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think in that next part, we're also sort of jump into what we see as, whether it's observability 2.0 or whatever, the next iteration where we see a lot of research and money and investment going into is incorporating more advanced analytics, machine learning, AI into these platforms. So we'll talk about that more and why it's important.
And the way this market has evolved, it's not like an Uber or the equivalent stepped in and suddenly created a new market. It's evolved both with existing and new entrants. And I think that's something we want to explore, and what that means from who you purchase from and partner with that might influence downstream implications of that. One thing I'd like to wrap up with, Judith, is we didn't talk about up front about Techstrong Research. We're a bit different in several areas. And one of the ways is we just don't hand out cards out of the deck and say, you're this person, you do observability, you're this person, and you do AI, like a traditional analyst firm does. We have these kind of 5 pillars of technologies, or areas of focus is probably the better way to say it, that really are critical, essential to any modern day strategy around technology and delivering capabilities and digital experiences. Do you mind saying a little bit about that and why that's important, why we think it's
Yeah,
valuable?
so we believe if you're going to take a real world view of technologies, you can't isolate them. So, for example, what we focus on is cloud, uh, data, and AI. Um, uh, I always get tongue tied when I think about the key areas.
Talk about security, DevOps, infrastructure, cloud native, data and AI. And make
Yes,
sorry to put you on the
thank you.
spot there to
So
recall it. We all talk
So
about it all day.
yeah. So those are the 5 areas that we are focused on, but we don't look at them in isolation because they're all interrelated. For example, you can't talk about DevOps and say, "Well, I'll think about data tomorrow," or "I'll do DevOps, but security, that's somebody else's problem." In this world where software is the business, all of these issues are interrelated. So that's the perspective that we bring, and we sort of the center spoke of all of these issues is business outcomes. So you can have the most sophisticated DevOps platform, but if it doesn't lead to business outcomes and solving business problems, then it's just a mental exercise. So it's how all of these elements provide the best business outcome to allow your business to thrive. So that's the perspective that we bring to all the markets that we look at. And I think
Yeah,
Des asked, when would the winners be announced? Everybody's a winner depending on what problem you're trying to solve. So what I've always said is if your problem is you're trying to measure a space, then a ruler is the best tool you could ever use. So it really depends on what business problem you're solving. And if that business problem is a winner because it solves that problem, then you're all set.
yeah, and following up on what Judith said, we could have spent 15 minutes talking just about open telemetry, but at the end of the day, it's a collector, and it's not doing anything for you. It's collecting the data. It's really important. I think that's why companies have circled around there as for open source, because you're not going to build a differentiator on the data collector. Instead, it's on what are you going to do with that data.
Very important point. So didn't mean it to turn into too much of a commercial for Techstrong Research, but hey, we're a business too. We have mouths to feed. To that point, folks can check out techstrongresearch.com. There's a lot of free content available there. We do a lot of things on video, like this webinar, but also on Techstrong TV, one of the avenues, and we have new products and content coming out on all the areas that we talked about around our 5 areas. Any parting thoughts on what would be a key takeaway if you were going to say, hey, I went to this really cool webinar that these Techstrong Research folks did, and I picked up this thought. It's a good idea. We should look into this more. Dan, do you want to start us out?
Yeah, for me, it would be that the market is moving really quickly. So, if you spend a lot of time and you choose a pure play observability company who's coming at it from a DevOps and Ops approach, don't be surprised if they're acquired. So keep your eyes on that.
Judith.
Yeah, so I would say that one of the most important and I think overlooked issues is business process and the customer experience. So observability, if we think about that, is about how you can take what exists, understanding the causality, what is causing my problems, and how can I make a change so that I have the right business process in place, and I really improve the customer experience, because all the business really wants to do is delight their customers so they come back for more. And we can think about observability as really one of the key enablers of creating a really dynamic customer experience.
Great. I'll just add as a wrap up, I think one of the unique things I mentioned earlier about this industry, part of our industry, is the role that open source is playing, and why that, in considering the open source projects that your vendors do or don't support, says a lot about where they're trying to differentiate and where the value is that they may offer. So I think we'll have a chance to delve into that a little bit more next time we get together for part 2. So Cody, I'm going to turn things back over to you. I think you have some wrap-up housekeeping to do. First, I want to thank Dan and Judith for all three of us for being
Thank you,
today.
Mitch.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And also mention to our audience, thank you for participating. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, if you have an opinion, you think we're full of hooey about something, you think we're spot on about something, we want to hear from you. Just send an email to feedback@techstrongresearch.com. and we'll be glad to follow up with you. And we appreciate your thoughts too. We're working in this with you, so we want you to be along with the journey with us. So back to you, Cody.
Thank you, Mitch. So we'll start off with announcing our Amazon gift card winners. The first winner of our $25 Amazon gift card is Joel H. Our second winner is LVOC. Our third winner is Sridhar V. And our fourth and final winner is Maureen G. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't find an email, just keep an eye on your spam folder. I'd like to remind our audience that today's session was recorded. So if you'd like to rewatch or share it with a friend, you will receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand. You can also find it living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. So Dan, Judith, Mitch, again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'd also like to thank Techstrong Research as a whole for sponsoring today's webinar. And I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for being with us for the entirety of today's presentation. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, everyone.